Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. We're so glad you're here. Today is the 77th episode. It's October. Can you believe it already? We've had a running joke on the show about what type of apple do you like best. I have to say, I actually did have a Honeycrisp. Stacy Frankovich, this is for you, had a Honeycrisp this morning. It was great. So I guess I'm on board that. I'm not back in Fuji land anymore. I don't know. Here we go. We're going to talk today. Let me bring up the agenda. We have got COVID Connect, the COVID news, as we always cover. After that, I want to share with you the pitch party results. We had the pitch party judging last week, had a great time with it, and we have a winner. So we'll just remind you about that. And then after that, a topic that I think you're going to find interesting. When FDA needs to pull the plug, or maybe less dramatic, when they need to communicate to companies, to healthcare providers, the ways that they do that, safety communications, recalls, and other mechanisms. We're going to dive deep into that today, and I think you're going to find it really interesting. After that, time for Q&A and events, announcements, as we always have time for. But first, the COVID news. We always look using the state of Michigan, from the data from covid.cdc.gov to see what COVID's been up to. And to show you that, I'm actually going to go straight to the PDF that the CDC provides each week, this for the state of Michigan. And this graphic, I was talking with somebody recently and they said, yeah, this graphic doesn't do a lot for me. And I said, well, yeah, the reason we show this one is because if there's a trend, we would see it. There's not a lot of trend that we're seeing in this graphic, but they do put it front and center on the CDC State of Michigan report. And the darkest counties in the state are those with high vaccination rates and high transmission rates. As it gets lighter, you head over in the lower case counts or in the lower vaccination rates. And it's just all over the place. There's not a lot of clear trends here. I think it's a cool graphic that they've created, but we're not seeing much trending in this graphic, and we haven't for weeks. When we look down the page at the cases, the case count, it continues to rise. We had thought this might start dropping. It also is the case that testing is rising, and the positivity rate is dropping. So that's always a balance between how much testing versus the positivity rate. Nevertheless, in raw numbers, case count continues to climb. Deaths still continuing to creep up. We had hoped to see this dropping off. We still don't see it dropping off, nor do we see it spiking. So I guess the latter is good news, but certainly hasn't flatlined again, and it is continuing to creep up slowly. In terms of vaccinations, a lot of data on this page. We won't cover it all, but 52% of the population of the state of Michigan fully vaccinated, which currently means 2 doses, the discussion about boosters notwithstanding. Of course, that number goes up to 83.6% for people 65 and older, who, as we've covered in previous shows, are the most at-risk demographic. And so that's good to see there, 84%. As we scroll down here, this is the hospital graph that we've showed every week for the last long while. And nothing like the first 2 waves. Now, you will still hear about hospitals being overwhelmed, but these days that appears sadly to be a combination of COVID admittances, as well as a lot of healthcare providers leaving for any number of reasons. We've seen a lot of loss, a lot of attrition there. So sad to see. So while this number isn't as high as those first 2 peaks, it doesn't mean that we're out of the woods in the state or in the country. Here's the transmission rate. This is really the 3rd major wave in the state of Michigan. How wide will that gap be, that deep red gap on the right side? Well, that remains to be seen. You can see the first one was a little bit longer than the second one, and we're deep in the 3rd at the moment. In terms of, we're going to skip past these data, haven't been ones that we've tracked a lot. This is the national picture on vaccinations. We usually come down here to vaccine doses, looking to see, is there an uptrend or a downtrend? There had been a slight uptrend until the end of August. That is now turning back into a downtrend, as it appears that the latest effort to get folks vaccinated is also starting to peter downwards. In terms of cases, the country is still awash in red compared to 3 months before, where that really was not the case. And if we come down here to hospital admissions, I have to say, just at a glance, this graphic is looking better. Hesitate to say that, but it does seem to be looking better. There used to be as many as 5 or 6 states in the deep red markers here. There's only 2 now. And so that's actually somewhat good news. I think you're seeing some of that reflected on the national news. Community transmission remains where it's been for the last number of weeks. Nationally, this appears like a second major wave over the course of this, at least since August of 2020, so we're missing some data there. And that is the end of the Michigan report. Not a lot of change, but we do want to keep you up on that from week to week as it permits. I want to show you next. We have a winner, and our winner last week was HDO Health with their novel Journiquet device. So they have received a check for $2,500. We wanted to also mention and thank Gina Adams from Wearology for her presentation, as well as Kevin White of Maverick Biomedical. Great presentations. Our judges enjoyed them all. So thank you to our participants. We are collecting participants for the next round of the pitch party. And it's a $2,500 quarterly party. We're going to see about the date for this last quarter because it's going to be right in the middle of the holidays. And when we moved to quarterly, we didn't quite think about that for Q4. So we're going to think about exactly when it happens. You can still get in though, because it's going to happen again. And we'd like to get those med tech companies in there. Our judges enjoy reviewing it, and we always have a good time of it. Remember, you can send a pitch deck to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org to be eligible for selection. We'll select a handful of startups to participate. Make sure the pitch deck has the normal areas: problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, competitors, and your ask. We've had companies forget the ask. That's really important. What are you going to use this money for? We'd love to know. And you can send those, and we will look forward to the next installment of the pitch party. We also have our judges. Our judges, Andy Rader, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, Jim Metzger, and Stacy Frankovich. Always fun to have them on the show. And we really enjoyed our judging last week. Before we get to our main presentation today, we did have a Q&A here. Ken asked, the 12 to 17 vaccination rate is quite low. How does Michigan compare with other states for this age group? Is there a Michigan priority on getting to this age group? Well, that's a great question, and we always like to answer questions live if we can. So we're going to pull just a little bit of data right here, right now, and see what we can find for a couple of other states. So if we go to cdc.gov, I'm going to just show you all how you get to this data, because it's something we haven't showed before. On cdc.gov, if you just go to the main page, coronavirus, learn more, go to cases and data. And you can come down here to cases, deaths, and testing. Oops, I'm sorry, we got that wrong. It's your community. If you look at the state profile report under your community, and there's probably a place where this is aggregated, but right now we could look, for example, at the state of New York. Here's the state of New York. And we can download that state profile report. Gonna have to switch our share here, which we'll do just like this. And we'll go down to the vaccination data for the state of New York. People 12 through 17, they've got 55% of that part of the population. It is a higher number in general of all people, 63% vaccinated versus 50-something in the state of Michigan. So we do see those numbers slightly higher. We could take another quick look at a different one. Let me bring up another state. What do we want to do? Let's do the state of California. In the state of California, which we'll bring up here momentarily, there's the state of California. They have substantial but not high transmission. Very interesting. They seem to be coming out of death and case trends. They're also at about 55% of people 12 to 17 vaccinated. They have a slightly higher total vaccinated percentage. As long as we're doing this, let's take a look at one more. We'll grab one at random here. We will look at the state of, what's one that we think might have a high one? Let's look at the state of New Jersey here. And in the state of New Jersey, hopefully our share is working correctly. You'll see it come up here momentarily. In the state of New Jersey, they're having apparently high vaccination and really high transmission, so not a lot of positive trends there. But if we go down to the vaccination status, they, like us, are in an upswing, even though their positivity rate is coming down. Looks very similar. And if we look here, they're at about 57% of the 12 to 17 population vaccinated. So again, if we compare that once more to the state of Michigan, which I'll bring back up again, we'll just bring that back up. Thank you for your patience as we do this live, but it was a good question. We always like to answer good questions as they come up. Coming back to the state of Michigan, so we've been seeing 55, 60% of the 12 to 17 age group, and in Michigan, 37%. So yeah, good question. Not quite sure why the state of Michigan is so low in that age group, but there you have it. Yeah, a good 20 percentage points lower than other parts of the country. So great question. Thank you for that, Ken, as always. And we're going to go on to our main feature of the day here. And here it is. When FDA pulls the plug, stop use and recalls. I thought this would be interesting to talk about today because we've been very focused over the last year and a half on COVID, emergency use authorizations, 510Ks, seeing new drugs cleared. You just saw the news come out about a drug that Merck has that's supposed to cut hospitalizations in half. That would be wonderful. So we're always focused on those, but we knew when all this started that things would get pulled. EUAs would get canceled. Product recalls would happen. We've never talked much about the mechanism by which those things happen, but I think it's instructive for those who are in the world of product development, bringing medical technologies to market, to look at how you can find out what FDA has been saying. Now, we're going to focus today on COVID-related devices. That's where our focus is going to be today. But you can look in this for all sorts of things. There's all sorts of things you can find under FDA's safety-related communications. Now, you may have heard before of the MAUD database, which is the Manufacturer and User Facility Device Experience database. That's a great place to find reporting coming out, especially of hospitals, about how was a device working? Did it fail in some way? Now, you've got to take those with a grain of salt. I remember one time looking at the MAUD database and finding that the little peel-off things off of a sticky electrode that went on your chest, people were dropping those smooth plastic pieces that were just meant to cover the adhesive on the floor, and then they were slipping on them. And those got reported to MAUD. So what you see is what you get. You've got to sort through these databases to understand, is this really critical? But MAUD isn't the whole story. It's a very important part of the story when real users give feedback on their experience with medical devices. So it's absolutely critical, but it's not the whole story. There's a rich interplay where sometimes FDA is going to the community and saying, hold up, there's something we want to communicate. We're going to talk about that today. It all falls under what FDA has as medical device safety pages on their website. And you can get to this at fda.gov/medical-devices/medical-device/safety. I love reading URLs. It's so much fun. That webpage looks like this. And I think it's very instructive to look at from time to time so you can see what FDA has been thinking about. And of course, during COVID, there's some interesting places where they've had to make communications. But it's not all about FDA communicating to us. If I zoom in on that column on the left side, you're going to see a few different things. You're going to see safety communications, which we'll talk some about today. You'll see medical device recalls, which may not be what you think they are. We're going to get to the topic of recalls here. Letters to healthcare providers when FDA communicates to healthcare providers. Medical device bans. That one sounds ominous and threatening. You're going to love that category, though. There's some, it's very interesting. Medical device reporting, how the public can report medical device problems to the FDA, reporting allegations of misconduct, regulatory misconduct, again, how they can be reported to the FDA, and then things on the MedSun Medical Product Safety Network. We're not going to necessarily touch on that today. In emergency, situations for medical devices, we're not necessarily going to touch on that today. But to touch on these other categories, let's dive in. First of all, medical device reporting, and this is all from fda.gov, so you don't have to scroll through their website. When you think about something like the MAUD database, you've got mandatory reporters, that's manufacturers, device user facilities, and importers. They're required to submit certain types of reports for adverse events and product problems to the FDA about medical devices. In addition, FDA encourages healthcare professionals, patients, caregivers, and consumers to submit voluntary reports about serious adverse events that may be associated with a medical device, as well as use errors, product quality issues, and therapeutic failures. These reports, along with data from other sources, can provide critical information that helps improve patient safety. So if you go to these safety pages, you can find out all about how to report errors to FDA. And that's great. We're not going to belabor that today. There's also information about how to report allegations of regulatory misconduct. Those could include a failure to register and list a medical device, marketing an uncleared or unapproved product, or failure to follow quality system requirements, or some kind of misleading promotion. And I got to tell you, we've seen an uptick in the number of Class 1 registered devices that really have no business being in Class 1, but the dirty little secret of Class 1 is that all you have to do is register, list, and pay a fee, and you're in the FDA's database. They're perfectly free to come after you, but oftentimes they won't, because things that are registered as Class 1 are beneath much of their scrutiny. So we've seen cases where oftentimes a device maybe should have been registered as Class 2, maybe should have gone through a 510K, but it's actually just registered as a Class 1 device. What if you're a competitor in that market? What if you want to do it right? What if you want to ethically bring your device to market and you realize that maybe a 510K is required, but your competitor didn't do that? Well, this would be an option for reporting allegations of regulatory misconduct, something that you could flag for the agency, and we've seen this kind of thing happen before. You can find that on the safety pages too. Again, we're not going to go into detail on that today, but it's good to know that it's there. More the focus of today, safety communications from the agency. The FDA posts medical device safety communications to describe FDA's analysis of a current issue and provide specific regulatory approaches and clinical recommendations for patient management. I think you're going to enjoy some of these we're going to get into in just a little bit. But that's not all. FDA also has letters to healthcare providers. The FDA posts letters it sends to healthcare providers about safety concerns with medical devices used in healthcare facilities. Now, there's only less than 20 of these every year for the last 5 years, so it's not a ton, but they are out there. There are some instructive ones relative to COVID that we'll touch on today. And medical device recalls. A recall, in most cases, is a company realizing that they have some violation of FDA law. It's usually not the FDA threatening the company. It's usually the company going, oops, we've got a problem here, voluntarily initiating a recall through some kind of correction or removal of the product. Maybe we're taking the product home to correct it. Maybe we're sending field reps out to correct it. Maybe we're pulling it off the market. But it's usually the company's motivation to do this. And also to notify the agency, to tell the FDA we're initiating a recall. Now, the FDA could compel a company to do that, but it turns out in practice this rarely happens. Usually the company will initiate the recall, and then FDA will recognize that and maintain that recall. There's 3 types of recalls, and if this isn't the worst reordering from what we usually see in the device world, a Class 1 device is the lowest risk device, where a Class 3 device is the highest risk device. Well, in the world of recalls, it's just the opposite. A Class 1 recall is the most serious. It's a situation where there's a reasonable chance that a product will cause serious health problems or death. All the way down to Class 3, where the product is not likely to cause any health problems or injury. So once these are classified, the FDA monitors the recall to ensure that the strategy is effective and it's being followed. And only after it's assured that it's no longer violating the law and no longer presents a health hazard, that's when FDA terminates the recall. So it's a process initiated by the company, not usually by FDA, although legally they are able to do that. And this brings us to the category that is medical device bans. Now that sounds scary and intimidating. And in fact, a ban is a total prohibition on the current and future sales, distribution, and manufacturing of a type of medical device. Well, the good news is that this has almost never happened. In fact, there's only 3 bans on the books. One is an electrical stimulation device for aggressive behavior. Sounds like a form of electroshock therapy for aggressive behavior. Interestingly, in 2017, one is for powdered surgical or exam gloves, a banned device. That's interesting because we all remember when those were on the market. And finally, the first one that was ever banned, a prosthetic hair fiber. So if you're not in those three domains, you're not going to have to worry right now about bans, it sounds like. But it is a category that FDA maintains and is able to exercise and has exercised now 3 times. So let's talk about what we're here today to talk about, which is COVID-related communications, letters, and recalls. Over the course of the last year and really 2 years, FDA has issued letters, communications, and recalls relative to devices and tests for COVID. I'm going to read through this list first of all, and then we're going to go to the web pages and we're going to go through these communications. The first one, and this is the one that actually caught our eye, that made us think to talk about this topic, is the risk of exposure to unsafe levels of radiation with a UV wand. Everyone was really excited about UVC, and UVC is amazing. There's some really cool applications for UVC. But of course, it's not inherently safe in all contexts. And that's what we're going to talk about with this communication. Also, there was a communication, a letter to healthcare personnel in facilities when the FDA said, you really can't use non-NIOSH approved or decontaminated disposable respirators anymore. There was a stop use communication, safety communication from the agency, and a recall for a SARS-CoV-2 antigen rapid qualitative test from Innova. There was also a stop use and recall for this LIPU medical technology SARS-CoV-2 antigen and antibody tests. Then there was a safety communication talking about antibody testing. And I think you're going to find that one particularly interesting because you've seen in the news how many people use antibody testing post-vaccination as a way to try to determine if their vaccination is still good. This one might blow your socks off. There's more. Improper use of thermal imaging devices. FDA had a safety communication on that. And pulse oximeters, a safety communication on their limitations and accuracy. Reaching way back, you remember when ventilator splitters were a big thing, and we had a local group that had created a ventilator splitter. FDA sent a letter to healthcare providers earlier this year instructing them in what they consider to be the proper use of ventilator splitters. Another SARS-CoV-2 test, this one not with a recall. We'll talk about why that is in just a second. And then finally, this is another one that caught our eye. Wear face masks with no metal during MRI exams. Yeah, they had to make that communication. We'll unpack that one here in just a second. It's a little scary to think how that topic came up. But it's not just the nose piece that goes flying to the MRI machine. There's more, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So we're going to go to the web pages because there's no clean way to do this without just showing you the FDA's communications directly. And the first one is the risk of unsafe levels of radiation with this safety light UV wand. And this is a wand that you can take to expose things to high levels of UVC. It's a handheld UVC germicidal wand intended to emit UVC radiation to disinfect surfaces. Well, it sounds like a good thing. Get this. The Max Lux Safety Light UV wand instructions for use tell you to use it for 30 to 60 seconds. And the product emits a radiation level that's more than 3,000 times stronger than what is recommended by an international group of experts for an ultraviolet exposure limit. 3,000 times the current exposure limit. And this in a handheld wand that presumably you can point at anything. This at a distance of 2 inches. This can harm eyes, this can harm skin after a few seconds of exposure. Interestingly enough, they have not told them to pull the product. They did not initiate an FDA recall. They just sent a notification of defect letter. So obviously, and if you do happen to have one of these, please be aware. But this one just was kind of blew our socks off because 3,000 times the safety limit exposure in a handheld wand. We're glad FDA is making these kinds of statements. That's the first one, the Max Lux Safety Light UV wand. Here's the next one. This was a letter to healthcare personnel and facilities. And this, you remember the day when everyone was running around trying to get something in front of the faces of healthcare personnel. We heard stories from our friends and colleagues how they were having to wear N95s for weeks on end. And so it was good and right that we should try to get things that would do something more than nothing for those frontline workers. Well, but the day eventually came and communicated in this letter to healthcare personnel and facilities that FDA doesn't want those facilities, no longer authorizes the use of non-NIOSH approved, and no longer allows the use of decontaminated disposable respirators. So that loophole closed all the way down. And the FDA went back to the more traditional place where it's always been, which is it's got to be NIOSH approved or FDA cleared, as it may be. The next one for this antigen test, the Innova Medical Group SARS-CoV-2 antigen rapid qualitative test, FDA safety communication. It's important to realize that this came alongside of a recall. We'll click to that tab where the basis for the recall, labeling distributed with certain configurations of the test, includes performance claims that did not accurately reflect the performance estimates observed during the clinical studies of the tests. So this didn't even agree with its own clinical trials. So two things happened. One is the recall that happened in April. Don't use the tests, identify them, remove them, destroy them, return them, just get rid of them. And along with that came this stop use directive. So both the recall and the stop use directive, the information in both is relatively similar. But that's how FDA is getting out there and saying, wait, hold on, don't use this. Here's a similar one. For the Lipu Medical SARS antigen test, here's the safety communication, and here's the recall. Safety communication and the recall. This one was fascinating. Antibody testing is not currently recommended to assess immunity after COVID-19 vaccination, FDA safety communication from May of this year. Of course, you know that that is one of the most popular things to do if you've got cash to burn, is go out and do your antibody testing to find out if your vaccination is still good. FDA explicitly addressed this, and I don't think I ever heard this make the news. What they say is, be aware that the antibody tests are to help determine if somebody had the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. Were they prior infected? That's the point of an antibody test. It's not to determine if your vaccine is still efficacious. And they've come out very clearly, and they've said this. So if you've not been vaccinated, there is a good chance that a positive antibody test means that you have, you've had SARS-CoV-2. Possibly you were previously infected, but it doesn't tell you how effective that infection was. And by the same token, if you've got the vaccine and you get the antibody test, it doesn't tell you how effective the vaccine was. And in fact, it's really meant to look at the virus, not at the vaccine. So they just came out really strong and said, look, this is not what these antibody tests are for. And credible news sites will report that. They'll say there's no agreement between these different test levels. You can't find out the efficacy from these. But it's neat to see that FDA had come out, for those who are willing to look, and already communicated that. How about this one? You've all walked into the building with thermal imaging device that's sitting on the wall, and they basically say, hey, can we take your temperature? Okay, you're free to go. Well, FDA came out against that very clearly as well. Not to say don't use thermal imagers as a part of a screening protocol, but if you actually want to know if somebody has the SARS-CoV-2 virus in them, you're going to need to test them. And apparently people were doing mass screenings. They were taking thermal images of groups of people and trying to determine if one person among them had a fever. And FDA is just saying, no, 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 don't do that, don't do that. They say the accuracy of thermal imaging systems depends on careful setup and operation. They measure the skin temperature, so you can't necessarily trust them when someone's come in from the hot or from the cold. We do still see people using these, and FDA has issued pretty clear guidelines for when these can and should be used and how they're really only part of a screening methodology. So it's good to see them communicating this kind of safety information about thermal imaging systems. Also, how many of us haven't thought about running out to get a pulse oximeter from CVS? Well, it's similar here, but there's a really important point here, which is that pulse oximeters, according to FDA, they have limitations and risks of inaccuracy under certain conditions that should be considered. One of the biggest ones is that the devices may be less accurate in people with dark skin pigmentation. FDA doesn't here elaborate on that, but throughout this document, they simply unpack how the reading that your pulse oximeter gives you isn't exactly the same thing as your arterial blood saturation. A reading of 90% may represent an arterial blood saturation of 86 to 94%. They basically go to disabuse people of thinking that these are an accurate, just read the number and you've got your answer kind of a test. And so again, this is a communication, a safety communication from the agency. I don't find that these safety communications are well publicized. If you're subscribed to FDA and their communications, you may see these things. It's something that we do all the time. But if you're not, you may not see these. In a minute, I'll talk about why this is important in non-COVID related areas. Ventilator splitters, we all remember the ventilator splitters. What a phenomenal effort when it looked like there was going to be a surge on the use of ventilators. Of course, now much less focus on ventilation if we can avoid it. And in fact, FDA's communication to healthcare providers: consider non-invasive ventilation such as high flow nasal oxygen or non-invasive positive pressure as a first option prior to using an authorized ventilator splitter. Even though they're there, they are legal to use, think about these other things first. They have guidance: no more than 2 patients, limit duration to 48 hours. This is still current guidance, so it's interesting that this is still an option for folks to use in the hospitals. And they've got guidance on reservation of a single patient ventilator. So they're talking not only about how to use the device, but also how to manage treatment. And it sounds like the New York Presbyterian Hospital ventilator sharing protocol is one that the FDA has actually tipped their hat towards and referenced here. Well, just a few more. Here's another SARS-CoV-2 assay, but this one doesn't come with a recall. Why is that? Why, if there's a safety communication, would you not have a recall to go along with it? Well, the answer is simple. This was an emergency use authorization, and right at the top, it says that the curative SARS-CoV-2 assay is revoked at the company's request, effective in July, because the company is now using different EUA authorized tests for testing offered at its laboratories. So they basically just backed out of the whole thing and said, we're going to ask you to revoke our EUA. We're going to make this safety communication. But it sounds like there was a large risk of false negative results with this particular assay. And so FDA is getting out there and saying, hey, don't use this anymore. Which brings us to our last safety communication for the day. Wear face masks with no metal during MRI exams. FDA safety communication. If it weren't sad, this one would be funny, but metal inside of MRIs is dangerous. And dangerous in ways that I hadn't necessarily thought about. You remember that back in the day, we would often talk about masks and talk about how face masks were to be sold without additives, without antimicrobial agents, etc. When FDA was doing emergency use authorizations, they really just wanted you to get masks out there without a lot of stuff in them. Here's an unintended consequence of having other things in masks. We're all familiar with the nasal bridge that's oftentimes a piece of metal. And FDA warns about that. Metal parts like nose pieces, sometimes called nose clips or wires, nanoparticles, or antimicrobial coating that may contain metal may become hot and burn the patient during an MRI. The FDA recommends patients wear face masks with no metal during MRIs. The FDA recently received a report that a patient's face was burned from the metal in a face mask worn during an MRI. This is a very sad thing to have happen. It sounds obvious, but it's really not. We all started putting face masks on. You wouldn't have been wearing a face mask in an MRI, and now you're inside the MRI and you've got this thing on, and it's got metal in the nose piece, possibly even metal as an antimicrobial layer, and that's just not a good place to be. So an important communication at the end of last year from FDA, something we wouldn't often think about, but I think you can see why this is an important avenue for communicating safety-related information. Let's bring it back home for those of us who are engaged in startups that are doing new product development, that are engaged with the agency and sometimes are wondering, why are you so concerned about X, Y, and Z? Why is that issue so big for you? Well, if I take you back to just one of these safety communications pages, here's the top level page, and we can look through here. If we look, for example, let's look at recalls. Now we're going outside the world of just COVID. We're looking at medical device recalls in 2021 in general. Here's a place where, let's go down here. We're going to find there were some interesting ones a little ways down here. Well, let's take a look at this. Here's one from earlier this year that has to do with stent migration from Boston Scientific. Let's say you're engaged in the business of developing a new stent. Would you think that somewhere just after May of 2021, if you were to engage FDA in stent development, they might have a few extra questions for you? This isn't just a mod-related thing. This isn't just a user experience-related thing. This is a place where FDA has so identified that there's a problem in this category of device that they're willing to offer a safety communication back to the industry. It's not just raw data, it's saying we've identified a problem. Or in this case, a recall that we've said, yeah, this really should stop being sold or removed or reprocessed or whatever it is. You'll also see this for infusion pumps. Now, if it's just a cracked bezel, I don't think anybody really cares too much at a deep regulatory level. But if it's evidence of systemic things and you're wondering, why is FDA so hot to trot on some issue that I'm currently wrestling with them? Take a look at the safety communications. Maybe it's a catheter, maybe it's an infusion pump, maybe it's something else. But if they've recently been wrestling with industry on a safety communication or a recall, wouldn't it be great to know that that's on their mind, that they've been thinking about it? Get a little more information for your submission to the agency. I think it's a great way to look at what's on FDA's mind to the level that they care to communicate back to industry. And so that's a little bit about safety communications. When FDA pulls the plug, there's a lot of things here. If there's one criticism that we've heard, it's that FDA maintains a lot of different databases. They've even broken some databases up into different categories. It's not always clear what the reasoning was for that. So we're not going to go into their databases. That is a touchy subject. But this is places where FDA has said, we've got a problem, Houston, issued the safety communication, accepted the recall and monitored it, sent letters to healthcare providers. And again, maybe it's not the COVID issues that affect your company. Maybe it's that catheter you're trying to bring to market. Maybe it's that infusion pump that you're working on. Whatever it is, take a look through these, scan through them, and see if something has been on FDA's mind recently. You're going to get a head start. You're going to get a jump start on what those issues are. So with that, we'll stop the share on that little presentation. And it is time for any questions that you may have, either about what we just talked about, or about anything that we've talked about on the show, or about any events that are coming up. We would love to hear about events coming up on your company's or your entity's schedule. Tell us about those. If you have any, feel free to bring those up right now. Raise those hands if you have a question or a comment. We'll give about another 30 seconds for that. And our friend Ken Spencer.
Yeah, thank you, Gene. Really informative presentation. So recently, we've come across, and we've been very involved in machine learning and artificial intelligence in terms of looking at EHR data and things. Recently,
electronic health record data. Yeah, and if you can get a little closer to your microphone, Ken, we're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Sorry. So recently, we came across several articles in the journals about the deterioration of the AI and ML algorithms and how they need to be monitored. So I have a question, and we are way behind in the medical community compared to other people who are using AI and machine learning, right? But if you have a monitor system that is looking at AI and ML models, do you think that would be something that the FDA would look at, or would it be the requirement of the person who is putting the AI or machine learning algorithm out there to get the FDA clearance?
Can you rephrase that slightly? I missed option A.
So the fact is that, which is not well known out there, is that the AI and machine learning algorithms actually deteriorate over time. And in fact, sometimes the better your algorithm, the worse it looks. So you have to have a monitoring system, which has been in place in other purviews outside of medical community. So the question is, if you have a monitoring system out there, are the people who are developing the monitoring system have to go through, do you think they have to go through FDA stuff? Or is it the fact that if you have an AI or machine learning algorithm that you put out there that has already been, approved, is it your requirement to institute this monitoring system?
That's a great question, Ken. Yeah, I think I understand where you're going with that. So just to recap, a medical device is a device that is used in the diagnosis or treatment of a disease state or condition, right? So we are starting to see these types of algorithms being cleared by the agency through de novos, for example. When you develop a device, you have to analyze the risks associated with it. And that's a total product life cycle kind of analysis. Yeah, you have to get your de novo and you've got to convince FDA that it's safe then, but then throughout the life cycle of the product. So the kind of thing that you're talking about, knowing about a product, could emerge because the industry already knows about it and we're going to address it during the application to the FDA. It could emerge later in the process as we're monitoring the life cycle of the product. We start to realize this and now it's time to address it. If that is something that's necessary for the device, chances are FDA is going to get involved. Chances are it's going to get cleared. Could you imagine a separate medical device that is there for the monitoring of this? Yeah, this is just my guessing, but I would wager that if this becomes a widely known thing about these algorithmic approaches to monitoring, that it's simply going to become a requirement that FDA has. Maybe someday it would eventually become a special control. Remember us talking about general controls and special controls. You could even imagine that someday it becomes a special control for the FDA. I think it could be addressed anyway. I would anticipate that as it becomes more known, the companies responsible for putting those algorithms out there, the algorithmic diagnostics, will have to address that as a part of their risk mitigation. Does that help?
Yes, I mean, it's a really interesting thing. I mean, we actually have a real world example of a deployed model we did at University of Michigan where initially the algorithm really proved beneficial, and then all of a sudden we saw this uptick in things, and it turns out that the better the model is, the more options you have for it to look bad. It's kind of crazy out there. So, but I haven't seen nothing from the FDA, about this at all. Although there are some really high-end journal publications right now about this deterioration.
No, that's really interesting. I will say also that, and we've talked on the show before about how it seems like FDA is slow when it comes to approving these kinds of products because they're very, very risk averse. That being said, if these kinds of things can be characterized over time, and you discover that a way of monitoring a system enables it to be used reliably, enables it to be used safely and effectively when before the agency couldn't stomach it, I think that's progress. I think that's a good thing because then we're starting to realize as an industry, okay, these are the limitations. When it comes to risk management, you've got inherent safety by design, you've got risk mitigations that are safety designed around the product, and then you've got warnings, and warnings aren't terribly effective. So if you realize that there isn't a way to inherently make the design safe, but there is a way to add a safety feature that's now understood, that should probably be seen as progress for the industry, and hopefully FDA will be able to understand that.
Yeah, I hope so too, because it's a really interesting phenomena that's really emerged out of here just recently.
That's great, great insight, Ken, and thank you for that question. Appreciate it. Great. We'll leave another 30 seconds if there's anyone else who has an announcement or a question. We are so glad you joined us today. I thought it was really interesting to see a lot of the places where FDA is doing their best to get information out there. I'm not sure we're always listening, but again, I think the silver lining to all of this is if you're out there engaged in product development and you're getting ready to approach FDA on a topic, scanning those safety pages with respect to devices that are similar to yours could tip the hand as to what FDA's been thinking about in that product category in a very specific way. So hopefully that's useful to you. Next week, we will look forward to being back with you next Friday. Hope you all have a great weekend. Get out there, start enjoying those apples and enjoying this fall. Thanks for being with us on MedTech Crossroads. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.